JRE number 2417. Erosion on the Giza Plateau may be hiding a forgotten chapter of humanity.
I mean, and again, with the cataclysms that we know have happened, the Younger Dryas just being the most recent, but if you go back several 100,000 years, you have these massive, interglacial periods and glacial maximum periods, right? That these cycles that we go through where you have this big glaciation buildup, and then you have just, these what must have been catastrophic floods, and then interglacial periods. In fact, there was a period called the Aeolian period. It was about 120,000 years ago. That was very much like the Holocene that we're in today. In fact, it lasted longer than the Holocene has currently lasted. We've been in the Holocene maybe 10,000 years, 11,000 years. I think the Aeolian period was more than 15 to 20,000 years, where it was stable weather. Sea levels were like 3-4 meters higher than where they are today, but it wasn't like this. It wasn't like it wasn't like the height of a glacial maximum where it's a difficult place to live. It was right. It was a calm period. I mean, the only reason our civilization is here today is because of the nice weather of the Holocene, right? We have warm weather. We haven't had like massive catastrophes that have been like extinction level events kind of thing to get in our way and knock us back to the Stone Age. There was a similar period like that lasted longer than we've been in this nice period, about 120,000 years ago. And if you consider after that the cycles of glaciation and flooding, then particularly the Younger Dryas, there'd been just almost nothing left. It's just the stone in places that survived what happened afterwards. So I do like my range of possibilities for, when did these artifacts originate? Like, when did some of this architecture originally be built? It's not, to me, just 15,000 years ago. It could be 100, 200,000 years or even more. And again, more contextual evidence to support that is things like the erosion that we can see on some of these sites. One of my favorite topics in the last couple of years has been looking at the erosion on the Giza Plateau.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up.
And of some of the big monuments, in particular, like the whole Middle Pyramid complex on the Giza Plateau.
Let's show some of the images that you used in some of your videos, because it's pretty fascinating when you look at it. It's kind of undeniable.
It is, and what's fun about this is that we don't have to guess, right? We know how long it takes. Studies have been done about like limestone erosion. Turns out there's almost an endless number of conveniently dated limestone slabs all around the world. They're tombstones in cemeteries, right? So they get dated, they get cut, they get inscribed with the date when it was put up. And then so you can measure it, and you can come back over decades and measure erosion. And so how long does it take for this face of this limestone erosion to recede?
This is the nutty stuff.
Yeah.
Because we're assuming that unless something happened to the outside of that this was at one point in time flat and smooth.
100%, because there are still blocks that are protected. So a lot of this has been rebuilt. This is tricky to see. So you can actually see that the less eroded sections are actually modern restorations, because this is so eroded that it's falling apart.
Right.
And this isn't even the exterior of this structure. This is the interior core masonry. All of this was also, for God knows how many thousands of years, encased in granite.
It also points to a trend. It points to a pattern that when human beings find ancient things, they do renovations to try to keep them.
Yeah.
Which is one of the things that's been, over and over again. We've talked about that.
Yeah.
There's so many structures that seem like there's multiple timelines working on the same exact ground.
It is 100% a human tendency to renovate and restore all of these, to reuse these sites.
Even in a gross way, like what they do with the Sphinx, like the paws, that's gross.
It is. But we're renovating it and restoring it to use it as a tourist attraction. Like the Romans renovated it and restored it to use as a ceremonial center.
But it's a very shitty version of the original.
Yeah, I agree.
And there's a lot of assumptions. You're assuming you knew the form of it. You're making your own form over the feet.
I have a problem. Yes, that was one of my problems with they were talking about restoring the middle pyramid, like the third pyramid, like the Menkaure pyramid, the small one.
Yeah.
It's small. It's monstrous. But it has these granite casing stones, right? And the top 4 or 5 courses are still there, but it was at least 15, 16 courses of granite. And there's just all this granite, these massive granite blocks and rubble. And Mustafa Waziri, who was at the time the head of the Department of Antiquities, was talking about, we're going to rebuild it. We're going to put it back together. God. And I know this, and I'm like, please no, because...
What an asshole.
Well, he did something cool, which was he excavated in front of it. He did show that the courses keep going down. But then he's like, we're going to restore it. I'm like, dude, they would use concrete. It would be a facsimile of what it once was.
Is he still around?
No, he actually, because he said that, there was a lot of international outcry for that very reason. And then, in fact, the government formed a tribunal to figure out what to do. The tribunal was headed by Zahi Hawass, and he lost his job. So
Yeah,
he's not in that. Yeah,
don't restore
that's
pyramids,
not happening.
bro.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Nobody wants to see the restored pyramid. I want to see what's left.
Yes. Well, we can use our imaginations to. They are restoring a lot of things. I don't necessarily agree with this either. Things that are actively falling apart, sure, you need to buttress them. Like a lot of this wall. So this is part of the Middle Pyramid complex at Giza, and there's a lot of blocks like this. There are limestone blocks that are 11, 12 meters long, like 4 meters wide, 200-300 tons, that were stacked up on top of each other, and they eroded so greatly on the inside that they've actually fallen over. At some point in antiquity, they've fallen off. And so they are trying to buttress and support things that are going to fall. I'm all for that. But, there's a lot, just the amount of erosion that it takes for that to happen to blocks like this, of this nummulitic limestone, which is a very hard form of limestone, full of fossils. And you're talking like 2-3 feet in some places of erosion of limestone. And if you look at the studies that have been done into like limestone erosion rates, and there's been several. They've studied them in coastal wave action environments where it's like getting battered by waves. They put in rivers. They put limestone cubes on the top of one of the governmental buildings in DC and left it there and studied it over decades. And they're like, okay, it's tiny amounts. But in a normal weathering environment, right? This is assuming a lot more rainfall than what happens in Egypt, which gets very little rainfall, by the way. But a place like Washington, D.C., or somewhere where you get like 40 inches of rain a year, something like that, it would take of just normal weathering erosion to do 2 feet of erosion like this more than 100,000 years. And so, and that's, I think you can extend that because if the thing is, maybe there was more rainfall here at some point. We know there was since about 4000 BC, the African humid period was in place. That's another big, I think, tell for what happened, particularly on the Giza Plateau and the sites in Egypt. In that, one of the things that's always mystified me about the Sphinx is like it's spent so much time buried in sand up to its chest over the last several thousand years, more time than it hasn't been. We have to work pretty hard to keep the sand out of it now. In fact, there are multiple attempts to dig it out of the sand in the 1800s that failed, and then they just literally 2 or 3 years later, it's sort of buried up to its chest again. Seems like a design flaw. Like, why would you build this thing in a low spot in a windy desert where it's going to fill with sand? It's just, I don't think...
Who's it attributed to again?
Khafra.
That's right. And then wasn't there an inscription where Khafra said that if he could uncover the Sphinx, he would be the pharaoh?
This is right. It's actually Thutmose IV. That's called there's a stele in front of in the chest in there in the Sphinx.
So Thutmose IV.
About 1,000 years later,
he was the one that was saying if he uncovered it.
So we knew it was buried in sand during the dynastic Egyptian civilization.
That was what I was going to get to.
Yes.
So that during that time, no erosion.
Well, this is a whole so there's a whole other
so it's protected.
Right. So this is another big issue with the wind and sand erosion. When you talk specifically about the Sphinx enclosure, I mean, this is one of the big controversial. I mean, for
here's the big
academics.
One: the face isn't eroded.
Exactly.
And if it's wind and sand, that's the only thing that's exposed, and that's not as eroded.
It's been one of my major points for a long time. It is, to be fair, the yardang, the sedimentary layers of limestone. It is a slightly harder form of limestone, but still, you're talking thousands and thousands of years where the only thing above the sand level was basically the face. And they explain all of this deep erosion on the body of the Sphinx and the Sphinx enclosure to wind and sand. I know, obviously, Robert Schoch is a different interpretation. But yes, you would see erosion on that, but you just don't. I think the most plausible explanation for that Sphinx is that, yes, the face was recarved in the dynastic period, probably it could have been by Khafra. Actually, may well have been before that as well, because there's other evidence that suggests that the Sphinx was already buried in sand at his time.
Wow.
The attribution to Khafra comes from two main sources. One is its position. So where the Sphinx is, you have the Middle Pyramid, you have the causeway that runs down, and you have the Middle Pyramid, you have the Pyramid Temple, the complex where we were seeing that erosion. you had this massive causeway that runs down to then the Valley Temple, which is this, very famous, massive megalithic structure. And right next to the Valley Temple is the Sphinx. And in front of that is the Sphinx Temple. So they sort of attribute it and make it, well, it's part of the Middle Pyramid complex. The other attribution comes from what's been written on that dream stele between in the legs of the Sphinx at its chest. It does say Khafra on there, but there's it's a controversial statement to say that means Khafra built it. There were several Egyptologists who had different, and this is back in the, early 1900s, they had different interpretations for what that said. What they believe it said was Khafra was trying to do what his ancestors had done, had done before, or that Thutmose was trying to do what his ancestors had done before, and Khafra is mentioned there, in terms of dig it out of the sand and become king. Like excavate it from the sand.
That's the move that everybody goes through.
Well, it's also, I think it's propaganda. It could be a great explanation for that dream style. It could also just be like governmental propaganda, right? So you could put that in there and say, see, I'm divinely ordained to be king because I dug this out of the sand. It could
just
be
in
just
the
a
interest.
story.
Yeah, just in the interest of keeping this standalone, please explain to people the whole deal with Dr. Robert Schoch from Boston University and the water erosion.
Yes.
I know, and if you've heard this before, I'm sorry. I just want it for people that are like, what? The water erosion that appears to be thousands of years of rainfall.
Yeah, it's actually good. It's good background context because it does apply to not only the Sphinx. It's the most famous example, I think, and well-known example of again an adjacent field of science coming in and challenging some of the doctrine that's been around Egyptology. But it was actually Schwaller de Lubitz who originally, I think, proposed it. His work was followed up by John Anthony West, who then brought Dr. Robert Schoch, who's a professor of geology at Boston University, to the Sphinx. This was, I believe, the late 80s, early 90s. And he went and looked at the erosional pattern. So the Sphinx sits inside an enclosure. It's carved from bedrock. So it was originally what you would call a yardang, which is like a limestone outcropping. And they cut down in this big enclosure, and they cut the floor, and then they sort of shaped the Sphinx from this natural outcropping of bedrock. So you had, and we know this because the structure next to the Sphinx or in front of it called the Sphinx Temple is actually, you can line up the sedimentary layers of the blocks that are in there from the Sphinx enclosure. So we know that there were blocks taken from here. So this is all predictably sort of cut walls, and the Sphinx would have been nicely finished when it was. And he looked at these patterns. If you go there today, I think I have pictures of the walls of the Sphinx enclosure in there, and it's just these deeply eroded vertical channels. And the Sphinx body's harder to tell because it's been restored so many times. The ancient Egyptians restored it. The Romans restored it. We restored it a couple different times.
Assholes.
Yeah, it's fine. But the nice thing is the walls of the enclosure really haven't been touched. So you can see the natural erosive patterns, and he looked at that and went, that's rainfall erosion. But not just some rainfall erosion, literally the result of thousands of years. It's the only way you would get these patterns in the stone is thousands of years of rainfall erosion. Obviously, Giza's a really, really dry. I mean, Egypt's a really dry place these days. You have to go back to time periods pre-4000 BC when the Sahara was a savanna. It was grasslands with lake basins and river systems, and it had a lot more rain. You didn't have this annual flood cycle that you have now. It was like a lot more rainfall. It was much more verdant and green. The Giza Plateau would have been green.
Which makes sense that's why they would settle there in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah, when they didn't build it in a desert. I mean, you wouldn't, because it would fill up with sand.
It also makes sense why they would flourish, because they had so much resources, because it was like so green and fertile.
Right.
They probably had plenty of plants, plenty of animals.
Well, there's a really other good point associated with that I wanted to bring up. But first, just to finish on the Sphinx erosion. So when Schoch came out and said this, he really thought he was moving the story forward, and he took it to an archaeological conference, and they literally laughed him out of the room, and they said, this is ridiculous. Like, where are the potsherds? Was, I think, Mark Lanner's comment, saying, like, where's the evidence that something's at least 12,000 years old? Mocking them. Yeah. So he got a good taste of the old boy network of the archaeologists on that day. But he's being very conservative in that dating also, of saying, well, 12,000 years. It could well be tens of thousands of years. And in fact, it seems more likely to me based on the erosional evidence that we see not only in the Sphinx enclosure, but elsewhere on the Giza Plateau. There's many places where you see just a huge amount of erosion that you can't really explain within the timelines and the climate of dynastic Egypt as we know it from, roughly 3000 BC till even now, because it's still eroding, right? But yeah, it could be vastly more ancient.
JRE 2136. A debate over the Sphinx may rewrite the timeline of human civilization.
I want to get to Egypt because I think it's one of the most bizarre accomplishments of human beings. And the age of Egypt is a fascinating piece of discussion. Because whatever it is, one of the more fascinating things is Robert Schoch out of Boston University, the geologist who examined the erosion in the Temple of the Sphinx and determined it to be thousands of years of rainfall, and which would predate the Sphinx by quite a bit. Because this is all stone that had been moved by human beings, and it had been used to construct the Sphinx, and this temple, the Sphinx, had been carved out. It's very clear that it was carved out. And you see these massive fissures that look exactly like water erosion. He specifically said that he showed these images to other geologists without telling them what they were looking at. And they almost unanimously said that it was water erosion over thousands of years of rainfall. And then when he would show them exactly what he was telling them to describe, then they didn't want to have any part of it, because it's like, okay, now you're saying something that's really crazy, because now you're saying that this structure is 11,000 years old as opposed to 4,500 years old.
Surprise, surprise, I'm going to disagree with you.
Shall we look at...
Well, it's not me. It's Robert
No,
Schoch.
Robert Schoch.
Shall we look
yeah.
at some images of the
Yes.
Sphinx?
Yeah.
And its
Let's look at images of the
Okay.
water erosion,
Yeah.
because it's...
and then I'll show some images of the quarries nearby.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
Sure.
So if you could hook me up again, Jamie, to the HDMI. And again, credit to my wife, Santa, who has taken every risk with me, every step, every dive for the last 30 plus years. This is her aerial photograph of the Sphinx enclosure and of the Sphinx temple,
How'd she
so-called,
get that picture?
in a helicopter.
Wow.
Back in, the mid-90s somewhere. Sphinx temple directly in front of the Sphinx, so-called, and the Valley temple to the left as we view it. And you can see that the Sphinx is a rock-hewn structure cut out of the bedrock with a trench around it. And if we go in here, the notion that the Sphinx bears the marks of precipitation-induced weathering is an evolution of an idea that the late, great John Anthony West had many, many years ago. You've had John on your show
Yes,
before he
twice.
passed away.
Yeah.
He was a dear friend of mine.
He was great.
Magical
Magical Egypt. I can't recommend it enough. It's such a fascinating
material.
He has two of them, two series. I think there's like 3 DVDs in each one, and it's just incredible stuff. Just on the undisputable things about the construction methods and how fascinating it is that they built these things.
Marvelous, out of the box
Yeah.
thinker. I miss him so much. He was a dear
amazing.
friend. It was he who brought Robert Schoch to the Giza Plateau. And Robert took a look at the erosion around the Sphinx and eventually came to the conclusion that the best explanation for it was that this Sphinx enclosure had been subjected to at least 1,000 years of extremely heavy rainfall. And Robert Schoch right now puts that back to around the 10,000 BC date, 12,000 plus years ago, during the Younger Dryas, when indeed there were heavy rains in Egypt. And it's these deep vertical fissures in the side of the enclosure wall which most clearly demonstrate what he's talking about, that the rainwater pouring off the edge of the plateau would have selectively cut out the softer areas of rock and created these fissures that we see through it, and this rounded, scalloped profile in Robert Schoch's view and in mine.
I've had Robert Schoch on as well.
Yeah.
We talked about it for a long time.
And I want to pay tribute to Robert Schoch here. He and I have had our differences, but Robert Schoch, in my view, is a hero. Robert Schoch is a mainstream academic who has stuck his neck out for an idea that is very unpopular with mainstream academics. He's taken all the risks for his career, he's put himself out there, and he's spoken his truth. And I want to respect Robert Schoch. I want to express that respect and kudos to Robert Schoch for everything he's done. He's helped to advance this field enormously and to allow people to think previously unthinkable thoughts.
And I've seen him attacked mercilessly.
Mercilessly. This happens again and again with archaeologists, unfortunately.
So
I'll just complete this point, because it's often said that the Sphinx was the work of the pharaoh Khafre, and that these two temples were the work of the pharaoh Khafre, particularly the Valley Temple that we see on the right there. There's no inscriptions in the Sphinx Temple, but when we come to the Valley Temple, what we're looking at is a limestone core, and those limestone blocks were actually taken out of the Sphinx Trench, which was then faced in a later time with granite. And there's a quote from Robert Schoch there, who's saying that basically the original temples were limestone, and that they were faced with granite. Now, that's the interior of the temple. You can see that there's definitely two phases of construction there. There's the granite, no dispute that that's Old Kingdom Egypt. And then there's the limestone massive megalithic walls behind it, which are heavily eroded, as you can see even from here. Now, interestingly, is that temple really associated with the pharaoh Khafre? In 1947, I.E.S. Edwards, who was one of the leading Egyptologists of his time, wrote this: "Around each doorway is a band of hieroglyphic inscription giving the name and titles of the king. No other inscriptions or relief occur anywhere else in the building." That's been taken to assume that the name of the king was given as Khafre. Actually, Edwards corrected himself in 1993. Around each doorway was carved a band of hieroglyphic inscription giving the name and titles of the king, but only the last words, "Beloved of the goddess Bastet" and "Beloved of the goddess Hathor," are preserved. No other inscriptions occur anywhere else in the building. In other words, there's nothing in that temple that directly connects it to the pharaoh Khafre. But what's interesting is the way that granite facing, which certainly was done in the Old Kingdom, has actually been, the interior of the granite has actually been cut to match the heavily weathered limestone that it's covering. It's been cut to shape that. They're honoring and respecting that ancient structure. And so, in my opinion, the geological evidence on the antiquity of the Sphinx is strong. There's no doubt that the ancient Egyptians were there, that they did work on the Sphinx. The head of the Sphinx was recarved into a human head. I and my colleagues believe it was originally the head of a lion, that the Sphinx was an entire lion.
But the evidence that it's been carved is that it has far less erosion than the rest of the body, correct?
And also the head is way out of proportion to the rest of the body. That's an issue, because one thing the ancient Egyptians were pretty good at when they put their minds to it was proportion.
Yeah.
And the disproportionate size of the head of the Sphinx in relation to the whole body of the Sphinx.
I mean, if you look at other ancient Egyptian sphinxes, they also have small heads. If you put my head on a lion, it would look small. And they all look relatively small.
Indeed, it would look small. That's the point. It was a lion before, and it was cut. It was heavily eroded, and it was then cut down into a human head.
But it does have a distinctly different form of erosion.
No, that's actually where I'd come and disagree with you. I have some photos as well.
What's your
Well, it looks
evidence that
way
it was
less
connected to
eroded.
Khafre?
The head. Oh, yeah, and
The
I can
head
show you
looks
why.
way
Yeah,
less
because
eroded.
it's a different stratum of the natural limestone.
I see.
So if you look at the geology of the area, are you finished, Graham? If not, I'll put up some slides.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, let's do this. So first off, I want to sort of show this is what it looks like, even the neck. You don't see the neck today because because they expanded the headdress as a support for the head. And so the point is that there's these different layers of this limestone here that we can understand geologically. And so there's this very dense limestone that's up by the head, and then the rest of the limestone is much more fragile and porous. So I do want to be clear, how do we date the Sphinx? What kind of evidence archaeologically are we using?
Mm-hmm.
And so what that comes from is largely radiocarbon dates from the pyramids themselves. So pieces of wood that were in between the blocks of the pyramids have been radiocarbon dated and definitively tell us that the pyramids were built during the Old Kingdom, right?
But didn't they do work on the pyramids at multiple stages where they would probably like reseal things and surface things and clean things? If they were constructed 12, 13, 20,000 years ago and people were still inhabiting them 5,000 years ago, wouldn't it make sense that they would do things to them?
Well, we have inscriptions in there from areas that are sealed off from the actual construction, graffiti from the workmen referring to, for example, Friends of Khufu and different workmen gangs that are in there. And these are in areas...
It's graffiti like they tagged
You know
it?
they tagged it, exactly.
You know
and
that particular graffiti in the Khufu cartouche has long been suggested as a forgery by Howard Vyse.
Except it uses versions of Khufu's name that were not known until later by scholars. And so that's
What versions are those?
I don't know, man.
Ah.
I don't read hieroglyphs.
Where'd you get that information?
Egyptologists.
Where'd you get that information from?
I got
Zawi
that.
Hawass.
No, not from Zahi Hawass. I've never met Zahi Hawass. I got that information from reading, man. But okay, so let's go back. How do we know that these radiocarbon dates with the blocks in the pyramid relate to the Sphinx itself? Because the Sphinx is just hewn out of natural stone, right? These different layers here. So the reason we know is because geochemists have done stone sourcing on the chemistry of these stones in the pyramids. And they've been able to trace them to different quarries at Giza. And so this is photos of different quarries and cuttings for the quarries. And so they've taken samples from the quarries themselves and from the stones in the pyramids. They do different kinds of geochemical analyses to show the ratios of, in this case, magnesium and iron. And then they trace them back to specific quarries there. And so they know that a bunch of the stones from Khafre, for example, come from the area of the Sphinx. The Sphinx is from a quarry. It's a quarry site for those stones. And so one of the things...
Go back to that slide for a second.
Yeah.
We're cut into the quarry walls. Okay.
And so this is a photo of some of these quarries, and I want to point out that the quarry walls look a lot like exactly the walls of the Sphinx itself. It has the same kind of erosion on it. It has the same kind of rough working on it. And so what you're actually seeing with the Sphinx is you're seeing this roughened shape from quarrying, which is then built with nicer stones around it.
Right, but we're talking about the temple, the Sphinx, the outside structure is what Robert Schoch was discussing. That shows much more clear indication of the water erosion. Not necessarily this, which shows a lot of kind of different erosion.
And by the way, this restoration on the paws of the Sphinx is modern.
Yes, that is
yeah,
modern. I'm not going to deny
Why
that.
do
But
they
what
do
I'm
that?
trying to explain to you is that we can't... A, I don't think that anybody really agrees with Schoch that it is erosion. B, if it
Well, you
is
can't say
erosion,
that.
well, a lot of geologists do not, nor do
But many
Egyptologists.
geologists do. Many
Very
geologists do
few,
agree with them.
Very few.
I think it's quite a bit. Graham,
don't
you would
know.
know more than I do.
I think it's quite a bit too, but it doesn't really matter to me. I think whether geologists agree with him or not, whether archaeologists agree with him or not, he's spoken his truth, he's made his case, and I think it's a strong and compelling case.
And what I'm trying to do is present the evidence that goes against him, right?
But when you look at those fissures that are in that wall,
You see the same thing on quarries there. You know, it's the same exact kind of fissures on this is just a completely different quarry in a different area of Giza.
that's not the most specific example of it, though. If you show other examples of that wall,
And so, I mean,
there's
well,
other examples of that wall that are much more rounded out.
So I
and
have
they
been to
dip
Giza, by
in.
the way.
See, this just doesn't look the same to me.
Wait, but I have a reason for saying that. I've been to
Okay.
Giza. The one time I went to Giza, it rained. In fact, the taxi got into an accident because the oil on the road got so slick that we were hit from behind.
Right, it does rain.
Very minor fender bender, but the
Right,
point
but you're
is,
not denying
but
that
how do you,
the climate
how do you
radically
date,
changed in
How
that
do you
area.
date erosion like this? That takes a lot of experimentation, and I've seen no evidence that shows how to date this kind of erosion to 12,000 years ago or something
Are
like that.
you in control of the thing now? Is that what's
I
going
am,
on?
and I was going to show
Graham,
some...
can you show images from what you were looking at when it shows the water erosion? Because
Sure.
it looks very different. The images that Graham was showing from where Robert Schoch did his work, it's much more extreme. The ones that you have are from a distance, and the other ones are kind of blurry, and you're looking at it, and it looks similar. But like
I was
that,
there in 2003, so it's been
I'm
a
sure
long
you
time.
were. I'm sure you were. But this is different. The fissures in there are different. They really look like water flow. And if you're talking about the different layers of stone, which are softer in some layers and harder in other, if you did have that kind of water flowing through it, it would make sense that the softer layers would be more eroded. And that's Robert Schoch's contention.
And how are you going to date that, though, to however long ago? One of the other key
But don't you date
I'm
it
not
though?
controlling the
But
slides.
don't you date it though by the amount of rainfall that we know took place at a certain time?
Because a small amount of rainfall can also cause erosion, especially in a dry environment. So
Right,
in
but
very
it
dry
could've called
environments, a
that-
tiny amount of rainfall can actually damage things even worse because things are so dry.
But that level of erosion?
Well, but you need to come up with some independent way of dating it,
Okay.
right? And that's where the issue is. What we do have is independent confirmation that the blocks in the pyramids came from the quarry right there.
Right.
And we have dates on those blocks from radiocarbon dates of wood in between those blocks.
There's an area where my work is misunderstood. I strongly support Robert Schoch on the 12,000-year-old dating of the Sphinx and of the megalithic temples in front of the Sphinx. I've never claimed that the pyramids are 12,000 years old.
Oh, I know. It didn't say you
I
have.
didn't say
I
you
know
did
some
either.
people do,
Yeah.
though.
Some people do.
Yeah, some people do.
I've never claimed that. I do not seek to divorce the ancient
That is
Egyptians
why I brought up
from
the
the Great
notion
Pyramids.
that they'd been resurfaced, because that's
Yeah.
the claim.
Yeah, I've heard that claim as
That
well.
people had been living in them for thousands of years, and so that the material that you're dating is from that time period.
Yeah.